In the heart of downtown, where glass-fronted restaurants lined the busy streets, stood the Golden Plate, one of the most successful establishments in the city. Its owner, known to everyone as Big Shaq, had built his restaurant empire from scratch, turning a small family recipe into a thriving business that now served thousands of customers daily. One chilly autumn evening, after receiving several concerning customer reviews about staff behavior and service quality, Big Shaq made an unexpected decision. Instead of conducting a formal investigation or hiring mystery shoppers, he chose a more personal approach. He would experience his restaurant as its most overlooked customers did, the homeless individuals who occasionally visited seeking warmth and basic dignity. With the help of his trusted friend who worked at a local theater, Big Shaq underwent a remarkable transformation. His designer suits were replaced with weathered clothes, his well-groomed appearance deliberately disheveled, and his confident stride transformed into a weary shuffle. Even his closest employees wouldn't recognize the successful restaurateur in this disguise. As dusk settled over the city, Big Shaq approached his own restaurant's entrance. The familiar glass doors, usually welcoming him as the proud owner, now stood before him as an uncertain barrier. His heart pounded as he pushed them open, the warm air inside carrying the aroma of his family's recipes, smells that usually filled him with pride but now made his stomach clench with anxiety. The host's desk, where he trained countless staff members to greet every customer with a smile, stood occupied by a young man scrolling through his phone. Big Shaq waited patiently, counting the seconds that turned into minutes while the host ignored his presence. When finally acknowledged, the cold stare and dismissive gesture toward the far corner of the restaurant sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. Making his way to the designated table, Big Shaq noticed the subtle shifts in other diners' postures, the way they pulled their bags closer, how conversations dropped to whispers, the uncomfortable glances. These were things he'd never noticed from his usual vantage point in his private office or during his routine walkthroughs as the well-dressed owner. A server approached his table, not with the warm greeting prescribed in their training manual, but with a curt, "What do you want?" No menu was offered, no water poured, none of the basic courtesies that were supposed to be the cornerstone of his establishment's service philosophy. Big Shaq ordered a simple soup, the most affordable item on a menu he'd crafted himself, and watched as the server walked away without acknowledging his request. As he sat there, observing his restaurant from this new perspective, more unsettling patterns emerged. He witnessed staff members mockingly imitating certain customers' accents in the service area, saw how some tables received prompt attention while others were left waiting, and noticed the stark difference in treatment between guests based on their appearance. Each observation felt like a personal blow, dismantling the inclusive vision he'd always held for his restaurant. The soup arrived cold, unceremoniously placed at the edge of his table as if the server feared getting too close. When Big Shaq politely mentioned the temperature, he was met with an eye roll and a muttered comment about being grateful for getting served at all. This moment, more than any other, crystallized the gap between his restaurant's intended values and its current reality. Through the window's reflection, Big Shaq caught glimpses of his transformed appearance, the smudged face, the worn clothes, the hunched posture he'd adopted. But beyond these surface changes, he saw something more profound, the invisible barriers that existed within the very walls he'd built, barriers he'd been blind to from his position of privilege and success. Other customers came and went, some receiving impeccable service that only highlighted the disparity in treatment. Big Shaq noticed a family celebrating a birthday receiving enthusiastic attention, while an elderly man in worn clothes was rushed through his meal with barely concealed impatience. The contrast was stark and undeniable. As the evening progressed, Big Shaq witnessed the full spectrum of his staff's behavior, from subtle discrimination to outright disrespect. He overheard conversations that made his blood boil, saw practices that violated not just his business policies but basic human dignity, and experienced firsthand the impact of unconscious bias in the service industry. Beyond the immediate issues with service, he noticed systemic problems, how the layout of the restaurant subtly segregated certain customers, how the pricing structure might inadvertently exclude community members, and how the staff's attitudes reflected deeper training failures. Each observation added another layer to his growing understanding of the changes needed. As the dinner rush began to slow, Big Shaq's emotions swirled between disappointment and determination. He'd built this restaurant with dreams of creating a place where food could bring people together, regardless of their background. Now, sitting in the corner with his half-eaten cold soup, he realized how far his establishment had strayed from that vision. His observations continued as the evening wore on. A group of young professionals entered, immediately receiving menus, water, and warm greetings. The contrast with his own experience was impossible to ignore. The same server who had treated him with disdain was now all smiles and attentive service. Big Shaq pulled out a small notebook from his worn jacket pocket, discreetly documenting each interaction he witnessed. Near the kitchen doors, he overheard two servers discussing their tips, making callous remarks about certain customers and openly admitting to providing selective service based on appearances. His heart sank further when he heard them mentioning a system they developed for dealing with less affluent-looking customers, rushing them through their meals and making them feel unwelcome enough to leave quickly. The restaurant's background music, usually a source of ambient comfort, now seemed to mock the situation. Big Shaq watched as a homeless woman entered, clutching what appeared to be just enough money for a modest meal. The host didn't even look up from his phone this time, simply pointing toward the back corner, the same designated area where Big Shaq sat. The woman's dignity seemed to shrink with each step she took toward the shadowy corner. Unable to remain silent, Big Shaq struck up a conversation with her. Her name was Rose, and she shared stories of how different restaurants treated people in her situation. Some showed kindness, while others, including his own establishment, had earned a reputation for their cold treatment. Each word felt like a personal indictment of his failure to maintain the values he'd started with. As the evening progressed, Big Shaq noticed something else: the subtle ways the staff had begun cutting corners on food quality and presentation. From his corner vantage point, he could see plates leaving the kitchen that wouldn't have passed his standards during regular inspections. The special sauce his grandmother had taught him to make was being hastily prepared, missing key ingredients that made it special. The breaking point came when he witnessed a young server being berated by a senior staff member for showing too much attention to a table of modestly dressed customers. "Don't waste your time," the senior server had sneered, "those types don't tip well anyway." The young server's crestfallen expression showed someone whose natural kindness was being systematically crushed by a toxic workplace culture. Big Shaq's hands trembled as he made more notes. This wasn't just about poor service, it was about the slow erosion of human dignity, both for the customers and the staff themselves. He watched as newer employees, initially eager and compassionate, gradually adopted the dismissive attitudes of their more experienced colleagues. The realization that his restaurant had become a training ground for prejudice made him feel physically ill. Through conversations with other customers in his corner, Big Shaq learned more about the community he'd been unknowingly alienating. A retired teacher shared how he'd saved up for weeks to celebrate his wedding anniversary at the Golden Plate, only to be treated with barely concealed contempt. A young student described how she'd brought her immigrant parents here, hoping to share her first paycheck with them, but left feeling humiliated by the staff's condescending attitude. As closing time approached, Big Shaq observed the cleaning crew arriving. Even here, he noticed a hierarchy of disrespect. The cleaning staff were treated as invisible by the restaurant employees, despite being essential to the establishment's operation. They worked quietly, efficiently, yet no one acknowledged their presence or contributed to making their job easier. The manager on duty, someone Big Shaq had personally hired 2 years ago, spent most of the evening in the office instead of supervising the floor. When customer complaints arose, they were dismissed with rehearsed apologies and no genuine attempt at resolution. The leadership vacuum was palpable, and its effects rippled through every aspect of the restaurant's operation. Big Shaq's disguise had revealed more than just service issues, it had exposed a complete breakdown of the values he'd built his business on. The warm, family-style hospitality that had made the Golden Plate famous had been replaced by a cold, discriminatory efficiency. The restaurant had become profitable, yes, but at the cost of its soul. As the last customers left and the lights began to dim, Big Shaq remained in his corner, completing his notes. The staff's behavior had actually worsened as the night progressed, with some openly making plans for after-hours parties using restaurant resources, another violation of trust he would need to address. His mind was already racing with plans for change, but he knew that surface-level solutions wouldn't be enough. This required a complete cultural overhaul, starting from the top. As he finally stood to leave, deliberately leaving a generous tip despite the poor service, Big Shaq felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a major transformation, not just for his restaurant, but for his entire approach to business and community impact. The next morning, Big Shaq sat in his home office, still wearing yesterday's coffee-stained shirt as he reviewed his notes from the previous night. The morning sun streamed through his window, but his mind remained in the shadowy corner of his restaurant where he'd witnessed the stark reality of his business's culture. His grandmother's portrait hung on the wall, her kind eyes seeming to ask what had become of their family's legacy of hospitality. He began drafting a comprehensive plan of action, his hand still trembling slightly as he remembered Rose's stories and the retired teacher's disappointed face. The first step was clear: he needed to understand if this behavior was isolated to one shift or if it had infected his entire operation. This meant more undercover visits, but this time to all his restaurant locations across the city. Over the next 3 days, Big Shaq maintained his homeless disguise, visiting each of his 5 restaurants at different times. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. While some locations showed slightly better service than others, the same underlying problems existed everywhere: discrimination, corner cutting, and a complete departure from the values he'd built his business on. At his downtown location, he witnessed a cook throwing away perfectly good food rather than allowing it to be packaged for customers who asked for leftovers. The West Side branch had turned their bathroom policy into a tool of discrimination, requiring purchases of at least $20 for bathroom access, a rule that had never been approved. The Riverside location had staff openly mocking customers' accents in the kitchen, thinking their laughter was drowned out by the cooking noise. By the 4th day, Big Shaq had filled 3 notebooks with observations and had taken countless mental notes of the faces, names, and actions that needed addressing. But more importantly, he'd connected with dozens of customers who shared their experiences, both good and bad. An elderly couple told him about a kind busboy who secretly brought them extra bread when they shared a single soup. A young mother described how a hostess had helped clean up when her baby made a mess, showing compassion when others showed annoyance. These small acts of kindness stood out like diamonds in the rough, giving Big Shaq hope that his company's soul wasn't completely lost. He began to identify staff members who still carried the original spirit of the Golden Plate, realizing they would be crucial allies in the changes to come. What struck him most was how the problems had evolved systematically. Through conversations with various employees who treated him as invisible due to his disguise, he learned how the focus had shifted entirely to profits and efficiency. The weekly staff meetings had become solely about numbers, with no mention of customer experience or community impact. The training program he'd personally designed had been shortened from 2 weeks to 2 days, prioritizing speed over service quality. The breaking point came when he overheard a conversation between 2 managers discussing a VIP list they'd created, a secret system that flagged certain customers for premium service based solely on their appearance and perceived wealth. This practice went against everything Big Shaq had built his restaurants on, yet it had become standard procedure across all locations. While sitting in his car between visits, still in disguise, Big Shaq began drafting a transformation plan. He knew that simply firing the worst offenders wouldn't solve the underlying issues. The problem wasn't just a few bad employees, it was a cultural crisis that required a complete overhaul of how the business operated. He thought about his own role in this situation. As the business had grown, he'd become increasingly disconnected from daily operations, focusing on expansion plans and profit margins. His regular visits had become perfunctory, with staff putting on their best behavior when they knew the boss was coming. He'd failed to notice the gradual erosion of values because he'd stopped looking with the right eyes. During his final undercover visit, Big Shaq spent time in the kitchen of his flagship restaurant, observing how his grandmother's recipes had been modified for speed and cost efficiency. The special touches that had made their food unique, the extra herbs, the careful preparation, the presentation, had been abandoned in favor of quick turnover. Even the portion sizes had been subtly reduced while prices increased, a change that had never received his approval. What hurt most was realizing how many loyal customers they must have lost over the years. He thought about all the families who had given his restaurant a chance, only to be met with coldness or discrimination. How many potential regular customers had they turned away? How many community relationships had been damaged? The true cost of this toxic culture couldn't be measured in dollars alone. As night fell on the fourth day, Big Shaq made his way to a small diner across town, one that had been his inspiration when he first started his business. The owner, an old friend who had mentored him years ago, didn't recognize him in his disguise but still treated him with the same warmth and respect shown to every customer. Sitting there, watching the simple but sincere operation, Big Shaq was reminded of what he'd originally set out to create. In that moment, surrounded by the genuine hospitality he'd lost in his own establishments, Big Shaq made a decision. The changes needed wouldn't be easy or quick, but they were necessary. Tomorrow, he would shed his disguise and begin the hard work of rebuilding not just his restaurant's operations, but their very soul. His notebooks were filled with problems, but between the lines, he'd also found hope, in the few kind employees who maintained their humanity, in the customers who shared their stories, and in his own rediscovery of what mattered most. The following morning, Big Shaq arrived at his flagship restaurant 2 hours before opening. He'd spent the night in his regular clothes, but the memories of his time in disguise were still fresh in his mind. The early morning kitchen staff barely noticed him enter. They were too busy cutting corners on the breakfast prep, just as he'd observed during his undercover days. He walked to the center of the kitchen and cleared his throat. "Everyone, stop what you're doing." The staff froze, surprised by his serious tone. Big Shaq pulled out a pot of soup base that had been prepared the previous night, the same type of soup he'd been served cold during his undercover visit. "This isn't our recipe," he said quietly, but his voice carried throughout the silent kitchen. "This isn't what built the golden plate." Opening his notebook, he began to read out his observations. The kitchen staff's faces shifted from confusion to shock as they realized their boss had witnessed everything. When he described how the signature sauce was being diluted and rushed, the head chef's face turned red with shame. But rather than firing anyone on the spot, Big Shaq did something unexpected. He rolled up his sleeves and began to cook. "Today, we're going back to basics," he announced, pulling out his grandmother's handwritten recipe book. "Every single item on our menu will be prepared the right way, and I'll be here to make sure of it." As he worked, he shared stories about each recipe's origin, reminding his staff why their restaurant had become successful in the first place. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the care and respect that went into every dish. By mid-morning, he'd called an emergency meeting with all management staff across his 5 locations. They gathered in the main restaurant, many looking nervous as they saw the serious expression on their boss's face. Instead of sitting at the head of the table as usual, Big Shaq sat in the corner, the same corner where he'd spent hours observing as a homeless man. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. He recounted his experiences from the past few days, watching as his manager's expressions shifted from disbelief to discomfort to shame. When he mentioned the secret VIP list, several managers looked away, unable to meet his gaze. As he described Rose's story and the retired teacher's anniversary dinner, one manager actually began to cry. But Big Shaq wasn't interested in shame alone, he wanted change. He pulled out a detailed plan he'd developed over the past few days. "Starting today, everything changes," he announced. "Not just our policies, but our entire approach to hospitality." He unveiled a new training program that would require every employee, including managers, to spend time serving in the community's homeless shelters and soup kitchens. The resistance was immediate. Some managers argued about profit margins, others about efficiency. One even suggested that catering to certain demographics would drive away their wealthy customers. Big Shaq listened to each objection calmly, then stood up and walked to the wall where his awards and reviews hung. One by one, he took them down. "These mean nothing," he said, "if we can't serve every customer with dignity." He shared the stories of the few employees who had maintained their humanity, the busboy who snuck extra bread to elderly couples, the hostess who helped the young mother. "These are our real achievements," he declared. "This is the standard we're returning to." Throughout the day, Big Shaq moved from station to station, working alongside his staff. He helped the dishwashers, manned the host station, and cooked on the line. When customers began arriving for lunch, he personally greeted each one, regardless of their appearance or dress. The staff watched in amazement as he treated a group of construction workers with the same warmth and attention he showed to a well-dressed business executive. By afternoon, he'd introduced his first major change, a new community table in the center of the restaurant. "No more corner seats for any customer," he announced. "Every guest gets our best table, our best service, our best food." When some servers protested about potential tips, he unveiled a new payment structure that emphasized fair wages over tip dependence. The changes weren't just about service. Big Shaq reinstated his grandmother's original recipes in full, accepting that food costs would rise. He introduced a pay-what-you-can option for certain hours, allowing customers with limited means to enjoy a quality meal with dignity. For those who couldn't pay at all, he established a meal token system that local shelters could distribute. But perhaps the most significant change came in how he handled the resistance. Rather than simply firing those who opposed his new direction, Big Shaq created a redemption program. Staff members could either embrace the new philosophy or participate in an intensive retraining program that included community service and sensitivity training. "We've all lost our way," he admitted. "But we can all find it again." As evening approached, Big Shaq gathered his entire staff for a final announcement. He shared his vision for the future, not just of the Golden Plate, but of the entire community. He spoke about turning their restaurants into gathering places where people from all walks of life could break bread together. The profit margins might be smaller, he acknowledged, but the impact would be greater. To demonstrate his commitment, he revealed one final surprise. He'd spent his nights converting the restaurant's private VIP room into a community dining space, where weekly free meals would be served to anyone in need. The room that had once symbolized exclusivity would now represent inclusion. As his staff absorbed this news, Big Shaq quietly slipped away to change into his homeless disguise one final time. He wanted to experience firsthand how his initial changes would be implemented. That evening, back in his homeless disguise, Big Shaq watched as his restaurant faced its first real test under the new policies. The dinner rush brought its usual mix of customers, but this time, something was different. The host, who had spent the morning in tears after learning about his boss's undercover experience, now greeted each guest with genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance. The changes weren't running smoothly everywhere, though. In the kitchen, tensions rose as cooks adjusted to the restored original recipes. The head chef, accustomed to rushing orders, struggled with the proper timing that the authentic preparations required. Big Shaq observed from his corner as a young line cook stepped forward, offering to help his superior master the traditional techniques. A particularly touching moment occurred when Rose, the homeless woman he'd met during his undercover stint, returned to the restaurant. Some of the staff recognized her, their faces now showing shame rather than disdain. But the young busboy who had always shown kindness stepped forward, greeting her by name and escorting her not to the corner, but to the newly established community table at the heart of the restaurant. The community table quickly became the evening's focal point. A wealthy businessman found himself sharing space with a street artist, while a teacher engaged in conversation with a corporate executive. The forced proximity initially created awkward moments, but as the evening progressed, barriers began to break down. The food, prepared with renewed care and attention, became a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected. Not everyone embraced the changes. Big Shaq overheard several regular customers complaining about the new seating arrangements, and a few even left when told they couldn't request their usual private section. Some servers struggled with their ingrained habits, unconsciously reverting to prejudiced behavior when stressed. Each incident was a reminder that true change would take time and persistence. In the kitchen, the return to traditional recipes sparked both challenges and revelations. A veteran cook broke down in tears while preparing the signature sauce, confessing that he'd forgotten how much pride he once took in getting it just right. The slower, more methodical preparation methods meant longer wait times, testing both staff and customer patience. But the results spoke for themselves. The food that emerged from the kitchen carried the soul that had been missing for so long. Around midnight, after the last customer had left, Big Shaq revealed himself to the closing staff. Their shock quickly turned to understanding as he helped them clean up, sharing stories from his undercover experiences. The night shift, often overlooked in staff meetings, opened up about their own observations and struggles. One dishwasher, who had worked silently for 3 years, finally felt comfortable enough to share his ideas for improving kitchen efficiency. The following morning brought new challenges. Word had spread about the changes at the Golden Plate, drawing more diverse crowds than ever before. The staff's dedication was tested as they faced longer hours and more demanding work. But something remarkable was happening. Employees who had previously counted the minutes until their shifts ended now stayed late voluntarily, invested in the restaurant's transformation. Big Shaq introduced another change: daily pre-shift meetings that went beyond discussing specials and sales targets. Each gathering began with team members sharing stories about meaningful customer interactions. Success was no longer measured solely by sales figures but by moments of genuine connection and service. The staff, initially skeptical, gradually began to find pride in these new metrics. The restaurant's physical transformation continued as well. The walls, once decorated with expensive art pieces, now showcased photographs of the community and the restaurant's history. Big Shaq hung his grandmother's first apron in a prominent spot, along with her handwritten recipes. These visual reminders helped ground the staff in the restaurant's original mission. However, not all changes were successful. An attempt to create a mentoring program between experienced and new staff members revealed deep-seated prejudices that needed addressing. Some senior servers resisted training newer employees from different backgrounds, leading to tense situations that required careful mediation. Big Shaq realized that changing policies was one thing, but changing hearts and minds would be a much longer journey. The financial impact of these changes began to show. While some regular customers reduced their visits, new loyal patrons emerged. The community table became known as a place where unexpected connections were made, drawing people who valued experience over exclusivity. Business professionals started booking lunch meetings there, specifically requesting to be seated with strangers. One of the most significant transformations occurred among the staff themselves. Those who initially resisted the changes most strongly often became their strongest advocates after experiencing the impact firsthand. A server who had once been notorious for judging customers by their appearance became the champion of the community dinner program, organizing weekly events that brought together people from all walks of life. As the first week of changes drew to a close, Big Shaq sat in his office, reviewing security camera footage from before his undercover experience. The contrast between then and now was stark, not just in how customers were treated, but in the energy and spirit of the establishment. The Golden Plate was becoming what it was always meant to be, not just a restaurant, but a place where food could bridge divides and bring people together. Yet he knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require constant vigilance and reinforcement. As he prepared to don his disguise once more for another round of observations, Big Shaq reflected on how a simple decision to see his restaurant through different eyes had sparked a revolution in hospitality that was slowly spreading through all his locations. As word spread about the changes at the Golden Plate, the local media began to take notice. Food critics who had previously praised the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere now wrote about its revolutionary approach to community dining. But Big Shaq, still regularly donning his disguise, knew that publicity wasn't the true measure of their success. One rainy Tuesday evening, he witnessed something extraordinary while sitting at the community table in his homeless persona. A local business owner, who had just finished a meal, overheard a young family discussing how to split a single appetizer between 4 people. Without fanfare, he quietly arranged to cover their meal. When the server informed the family, the mother burst into tears, explaining that it was her son's birthday, but they couldn't afford a proper celebration. The incident sparked a chain reaction. Other diners, moved by the scene, began opening up about their own struggles and triumphs. A truck driver shared how he'd been embarrassed to enter upscale restaurants during his routes, but now felt welcomed at the Golden Plate. A retired nurse talked about eating alone since losing her husband, until she discovered the community table where she never had to dine in solitude. These stories reached the staff in waves, transforming their perspective on service. The same host who had once ignored homeless customers now kept a notebook of regular visitors' names and stories, greeting each one with personalized warmth. Kitchen staff began adding extra touches to dishes when they learned about special occasions, regardless of the bill size. But success brought its own challenges. As more people from diverse backgrounds filled the restaurant, some wealthy regulars complained about the changing atmosphere. One evening, a group of business executives demanded a private section, threatening to take their corporate accounts elsewhere. The staff, led by a server who had initially resisted the changes, stood firm in explaining the restaurant's new philosophy. The transformation began affecting the surrounding community in unexpected ways. Other restaurant owners visited, first out of curiosity, then with genuine interest in implementing similar changes. Big Shaq found himself mentoring fellow restaurateurs, sharing both the successes and struggles of his journey. Some dismissed his approach as idealistic, but others saw the deeper value in creating truly inclusive spaces. Inside the kitchen, the return to traditional recipes had sparked a revival of culinary pride. Cooks who had been going through the motions for years rediscovered their passion for food preparation. The head chef, initially resistant to the slower pace, now ran cooking workshops for interested customers, sharing the stories behind each dish. The kitchen became a place of learning and cultural exchange, not just food production. The staff's transformation continued to deepen. A turning point came when they organized a special dinner service entirely on their own initiative. They invited residents from local shelters to dine alongside regular customers, with employees volunteering their time to serve. The event broke down barriers as people shared meals and stories, realizing how much they had in common despite their different circumstances. However, not all changes were smooth. The restaurant faced practical challenges as they balanced their inclusive approach with business realities. The pay-what-you-can hours sometimes attracted opportunists who took advantage of the system. Rather than becoming cynical, the staff worked together to refine the program, creating guidelines that preserved both dignity and sustainability. One particularly moving incident occurred when a former executive chef, who had quit in protest of the changes, returned as a customer. Seated at the community table, he watched the kitchen staff execute his old recipes with new care and attention. By the end of his meal, he asked to speak with Big Shaq, not realizing that the homeless man seated across from him was his former boss. His humbling words about witnessing the restaurant's true potential brought tears to many eyes. The impact extended beyond meal service. The restaurant's basement, once used for storage, was converted into a community kitchen where cooking classes were offered to anyone interested in learning. Local grandmothers shared family recipes, homeless individuals taught survival cooking techniques, and professional chefs volunteered their expertise. Food became a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected. The staff's growth became evident in small but significant ways. When a group of teenagers came in to split a single dessert, servers who once would have rushed them out now treated them with respect, remembering their own youth. The host began keeping a stash of umbrellas to lend to customers caught in the rain, regardless of their appearance or ordering habits. Big Shaq continued his undercover visits, but now he observed something different. Instead of discrimination and coldness, he witnessed countless small acts of kindness. A busboy helping an elderly customer cut their food, a server sitting with a lonely diner during their break, kitchen staff preparing special dishes for regulars facing hard times, all without prompting or recognition. The restaurant's physical space evolved to reflect its new spirit. The walls now featured a growing collection of photographs showing memorable moments at the community table. Customer stories were shared on a bulletin board, and the daily specials menu included dishes inspired by regular patrons from all walks of life. Even the restaurant's exterior was transformed, with a small garden where customers could harvest herbs for their meals or take some home. Yet challenges remained. Some staff members still struggled with ingrained biases, and occasional incidents reminded everyone that transformation was an ongoing process. But now, these moments were handled differently. Instead of punishment, they became opportunities for growth and understanding. The team developed a practice of regular reflection sessions where they could honestly discuss their struggles and successes. As the 6th week of changes approached its end, Big Shaq realized that his restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It had transformed into a living example of how a business could serve its community while maintaining its standards and sustainability. The golden plate was proving that success could be measured in more than just profit margins. It could be measured in the strength of the connections it created and the dignity it restored. 2 months into the transformation, the Golden Plate had become more than just a restaurant, it had evolved into a blueprint for change in the industry. Big Shaq, still conducting regular undercover visits, watched with pride as his experiment rippled through the community in ways he never imagined. One morning, he arrived in his homeless disguise to find a line of people outside the restaurant before opening. But these weren't customers, they were restaurant owners and managers from across the city, eager to learn about the Golden Plate's new approach. They'd heard about the community table concept, the pay-what-you-can hours, and most importantly, the restaurant's successful balance of inclusivity and profitability. Inside, the staff had taken ownership of the restaurant's mission in remarkable ways. The head chef, once resistant to change, now ran a weekly program where people from homeless shelters could learn culinary skills. 3 former participants had already been hired as kitchen staff, their life experiences adding new dimensions to the restaurant's operations. The community table had become legendary in its own right. Business deals were now specifically requested to be conducted there, with executives finding that the diverse mix of dining companions offered fresh perspectives on their projects. One tech startup credited their successful funding round to a chance conversation with a retired teacher who shared insights about their educational software. But it wasn't just the business community that was transformed. The restaurant had become a safe haven for people from all walks of life. A group of local artists began sketching during quiet hours, their artwork capturing the unique spirit of the place. These drawings now lined the walls, telling stories of connection and community that words couldn't express. The staff's evolution continued to surprise even Big Shaq. A server who had once been the most vocal opponent of the changes now led sensitivity training sessions for other restaurants. She shared her journey from prejudice to understanding, using her own transformation to help others recognize their biases. Her story became a powerful testament to the possibility of genuine change. One particularly moving development came from the restaurant's younger customers. Local high school students began choosing the golden plate for their special occasions, drawn by its inclusive atmosphere. When a group of teens couldn't afford prom dinner, the staff organized a special pre-prom service where students could enjoy a fine dining experience at reduced prices, complete with proper etiquette guidance and a photographer to capture their moments. The kitchen's return to traditional recipes had unexpected benefits. Food costs had initially risen, but waste had dramatically decreased. The staff's renewed pride in their work meant more attention to portion control and ingredient use. Moreover, customers were willing to pay premium prices for authentically prepared dishes, especially when they understood the care and time invested in each preparation. Big Shaq's grandmother's recipes became the heart of a new initiative. The restaurant began hosting monthly heritage dinners, where staff and customers could share their own family recipes and stories. These events brought together people from different cultural backgrounds, creating understanding through shared culinary traditions. The restaurant's cookbook was being rewritten, now including not just recipes but the stories and people behind them. The transformation affected the staff's personal lives as well. A dishwasher who had worked silently for years revealed his talent for organization, developing a new system that improved kitchen efficiency. The restaurant sponsored his business management classes, and he was now being trained for a supervisory position. His story inspired other staff members to share their aspirations and skills. One day, while sitting at the community table in his disguise, Big Shaq overheard a conversation that brought tears to his eyes. A regular customer was telling a newcomer about the restaurant's history, but not its business success or awards. Instead, she spoke about the lives that had been touched, the connections that had been made, and the dignity that had been restored through simple acts of kindness and respect. The restaurant's impact extended beyond its walls. Local suppliers, inspired by the Golden Plate's mission, began offering premium ingredients at reduced prices for the community dinner program. A nearby bakery partnered with the restaurant to provide job training for at-risk youth. The neighborhood itself seemed to be transforming, with other businesses adopting more inclusive practices. Even the critics who had predicted the restaurant's downfall were changing their tune. While profits had initially dipped, they had stabilized and then grown as the restaurant attracted a loyal, diverse clientele who valued its mission. More importantly, staff turnover had plummeted, reducing training costs and creating a more experienced, committed team. The restaurant's reservation system was reimagined to ensure balance between different customer groups. Regular clients learned to share space with new faces, leading to unexpected friendships and business partnerships. The host staff became skilled at creating seating arrangements that encouraged meaningful interactions while respecting everyone's comfort levels. Big Shaq's undercover visits now revealed a different kind of challenge, managing success without losing the personal touch that made it special. He watched as staff members remembered regular customer stories and preferences, regardless of their appearance or spending power. The challenge was no longer about preventing discrimination, but about maintaining this level of genuine care as the restaurant's reputation grew. The transformation had profound effects on the staff's professional growth. Several employees who had started in entry-level positions were now being groomed for management roles, their understanding of the restaurant's mission making them ideal leaders for the future. The training program had evolved into a comprehensive curriculum about hospitality, dignity, and community building. Perhaps the most significant change was in how problems were handled. When issues arose, from customer complaints to staff conflicts, they were addressed with the same philosophy of understanding and respect that guided all other aspects of the operation. The restaurant had developed a unique culture where mistakes were seen as opportunities for growth rather than causes for punishment. As the 7th month of changes drew to a close, Big Shaq realized that his undercover experiment had evolved into something far more significant than he had initially imagined. The Golden Plate wasn't just serving food anymore, it was serving as a model for how businesses could thrive while prioritizing human dignity and community connection. 1 year after his first undercover visit, Big Shaq sat in his familiar corner, once again dressed in his homeless disguise. This time, however, he wasn't there to uncover problems, he was there to witness the culmination of a journey that had transformed not just his restaurant, but an entire community's understanding of hospitality and human dignity. The Golden Plate had become known as the place where barriers disappeared over shared meals. The community table, once a radical experiment, had inspired similar initiatives across the city. Other restaurant owners, initially skeptical, now regularly consulted with Big Shaq's team about implementing their own inclusive practices. The restaurant industry was slowly but surely changing, one table at a time. That evening, Big Shaq watched as Rose, the homeless woman who had shared her story with him a year ago, walked through the doors, not as a customer, but as the restaurant's new community outreach coordinator. Her journey from the streets to the staff had inspired others, and her insights had proved invaluable in shaping the restaurant's evolving programs. She now led initiatives that helped other homeless individuals find their path to stability through employment and skill development. The kitchen had become a place of continuous learning and cultural exchange. The head chef, who had once prioritized speed over quality, now ran an apprenticeship program that attracted aspiring cooks from all backgrounds. The restaurant's commitment to traditional recipes had evolved into a celebration of diverse culinary heritage, with staff members contributing their own family dishes to special themed nights. A touching moment occurred when a young server approached a table where a family was celebrating their grandmother's 90th birthday. Instead of just taking their order, she brought out a handwritten recipe card. It was the grandmother's own recipe for apple pie, which she had shared during a community dinner months ago. The kitchen had secretly prepared it for her birthday, bringing tears to the elderly woman's eyes. These personal touches had become the hallmark of the Golden Plate service. The restaurant's physical transformation was complete, but its spiritual evolution continued. The walls now told a story of community and connection through photographs, artwork, and handwritten notes from customers whose lives had been touched by their experiences there. A digital guest book near the entrance captured stories and memories, becoming a living testament to the power of inclusive hospitality. Big Shaq observed as a group of business school students arrived for their regular weekly dinner. They had chosen the Golden Plate as the subject of their thesis on sustainable business practices that prioritized social impact. Their research had revealed something remarkable: the restaurant's inclusive approach hadn't just created social value, it had actually strengthened its financial performance through increased customer loyalty and reduced operational costs. The staff's transformation was perhaps the most profound. Those who had stayed through the changes had developed a deep understanding of true hospitality. They no longer saw their work as just a job, but as a calling. The restaurant's training program had evolved into a comprehensive curriculum about human dignity, cultural sensitivity, and community building, attracting attention from hospitality schools nationwide. One of the most significant changes was in how the restaurant handled special occasions. When a homeless man mentioned it was his birthday, the staff didn't just serve him a free meal, they created a celebration that included other customers at the community table. These spontaneous gatherings had become a regular occurrence, breaking down barriers between people who might never have interacted otherwise. The Pay What You Can program had evolved into a sophisticated system that maintained both dignity and sustainability. Regular customers often contributed extra to support those who couldn't afford full prices. Local businesses had started buying meal tokens in bulk to distribute to those in need. The program's success had inspired other restaurants to experiment with similar models, creating a network of accessible dining options throughout the city. Big Shaq watched as a former critic walked in, a food reviewer who had initially predicted the restaurant's downfall. The critic had become a regular at the community table, often writing about how the Golden Plate had redefined excellence in the restaurant industry. His latest review spoke not just about the food, but about the establishment's role in fostering human connection and dignity. The restaurant's influence had spread beyond the food industry. Local businesses had begun adopting similar inclusive practices, from coffee shops creating community spaces to retail stores implementing pay-it-forward programs. The Golden Plate had become a case study in how commercial success and social impact could go hand in hand. As the evening progressed, Big Shaq witnessed a scene that embodied everything he had hoped to achieve. At the community table, a CEO sat next to a street artist, engaging in animated conversation with a retired teacher and a young student. They shared not just a meal, but stories, laughter, and genuine connection. The barriers of social status and background had completely dissolved in this space. In a quiet moment, Big Shaq slipped away to change out of his disguise one final time. When he returned to the restaurant floor as himself, he saw his establishment with new eyes. The Golden Plate had become more than just a successful business, it was a living example of how one person's decision to see through different eyes could spark a revolution of kindness and dignity. That night, after closing, Big Shaq gathered his staff for a special announcement. He shared the story of his first undercover visit 1 year ago, though many now knew it well. But this time, he added something new. He was establishing a foundation to help other restaurants implement similar changes, with his staff serving as mentors and consultants. As he looked around at the faces of his team, the once prejudiced server who now trained others in inclusive service, the kitchen staff who had rediscovered their passion for cooking, the former homeless individuals who had found new purpose, he realized that his undercover journey had revealed not just problems, but possibilities. The Golden Plate had proven that a restaurant could be both profitable and purposeful, exclusive in its standards but inclusive in its welcome. It had demonstrated that true hospitality wasn't about elegant surroundings or premium prices, but about treating every guest with equal dignity and respect. As Big Shaq finally hung up his homeless disguise for the last time, he knew that the real transformation wasn't in the policies or programs he had implemented, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been part of this journey. The Golden Plate had become more than a restaurant, it had become a beacon of hope, showing that small acts of kindness and respect could ripple out to change an entire community.